Hey, I'm Jamie. I've painted thousands of pet portraits over the past 10 years, and now I'm sharing all my best tips and techniques with you. In this video, I'm going to show you how I make my sketch on the computer and then print it onto watercolor paper. It costs a little more up front just because of all the technology involved, but once you have it, it really streamlines the process and makes things go a lot faster, and the sketch is more accurate. I use my Wacom tablet, and whatever I draw on there with the stylus shows up on my computer. This is the printer I use. It's really old. There are newer versions of this, but basically you just need a laser printer that opens the flap in the front and in the back so that you can feed the paper straight through the printer and it won't bend. This is the photo my client sent me, and I'm going to be cropping and sketching it on Photoshop. If you don't have Photoshop, you don't want to pay for it, I would recommend trying a different program like Affinity. This is free and it does all the same things. There is a little bit of a difference in the way the program actually works, but it's not too hard to figure out. So I start with my image, and I'm going to use my lasso tool to try a few different crop options. So for example, this dog is laying, which makes kind of an awkward crop if you're not including the background. So I'll usually do like a crop around the neck, kind of like a bust portrait. There's also some other options where I could do the body zoomed in. I could do the full body, but I don't love this option for a pet portrait with a white background. Ultimately, we decided the thing we liked the best was an 8x8 and where we could crop it in close. So once we decided on the image, I can start the sketch. So what I do is I select the layer and I turn the opacity down, and then I create a new layer, and this is where I'm going to draw. I like to use just the pen tool on a 6 with, I turn the opacity down just a little bit so it's not so dark. And then I like to have a little bit of smoothing effect, just so my lines are a little smoother. This is at 35%. So if you're using Affinity, it's a really similar method. I just turn down the opacity here, like this, and then I can create a new layer on top of that. And this is where I'd be drawing with the pen tool. So that just takes a little bit of playing around with. I took a Photoshop class in college, and basically all my teacher told me was to Google everything. That's how we learned. So don't be afraid to Google if you get stuck. Once I have my layer ready, I want to make sure I'm on my selected layer and not on my photo so that I can make this disappear and just be left with a sketch. So I take my pen tool and I'm going to trace over the main shadows and lines of the dog. You're not so worried about creating like a coloring book, kind of solid outlines. This is really just creating a map. So I like to start sketching a little bit, and then I'll disappear that first layer to kind of see if I'm liking how the lines are, if they're too dark, not dark enough. So this looks pretty good right now. The nice thing about this sketch layer is I can always duplicate it and darken it. So I'll trace the main outlines like this. I click the E to erase and the B to go back to my brush. It's just a little shortcut that I use. So I trace the main outlines. I'm not so concerned with it being exact, but I do want to stay pretty true to the picture. So this is what I would outline for the nose. And it looks like that. I'm mostly worried about getting the proportions right, and this is a really fast way to do it. I don't ever have to draw it again. I can draw it once and I can print it multiple times if I need to resize it. Sometimes clients will decide they want a different size. It makes it really easy to email back and forth, and it's a really effective, fast way. So you can see I'm kind of just outlining the main shapes and shadows. I'm not so concerned about each individual hair. I do like to do the whiskers and like the main hairs. That kind of gives me a map when I go to paint of where things are in the image. So see how I didn't trace over exactly that whisker? It's probably fine, but if I want to fix it, I do Command Z and then I can go back over it. The other thing about tracing over these images is these lines are going to be printed on watercolor paper, and they don't erase like pencil lines. They are more permanent. You can lift a little bit of it, but think of it more as like a mix between a pen and a pencil, because you can't erase it completely. So you want to be careful not to go too dark, and you don't want to have too many solid lines. So like, for example, the bottom of his chin, I could just go like this, which is fine, but that's going to be a pretty harsh line on my painting. So instead, I kind of like to do more broken strokes, and I'll like draw these lines kind of down along with the fur, so that when I go to paint it, there's not going to be just like a solid line there. It's going to kind of blend in more with the painting. This is kind of the general idea of how I sketch on Photoshop. I like to use Photoshop because, for example, this eye is really clear and I can see the detail in it, but this one is just kind of like a black, dark blob. And so the nice thing is I can go in and draw this eye. It has a little more definition to it. And then I can select it with my lasso tool and copy it. I do Command J to a new layer, Command T, and then I will flip it horizontally and move it over here. And now I have another eye with a little more detail. I won't make them exactly mirror images of themselves, just because that's not how eyes work. We don't want it to look like copy and pasted, but it kind of helps me have an idea. So I'm gonna move over to my already completed sketch. You can see I can check the opacity here. I can make it darker or lighter to see if maybe there's some main things I missed. Oh, that was the sketch I was adjusting, which is fine. But let's go back to the picture, and I'm gonna turn that up all the way. And I can kind of double check to see if there's any main areas. I like to toggle back and forth like this that are kind of jumping out at me that maybe I missed. So doing that, I realized, oh, I want a little bit more of his cheekbone up here. There's not a specific line here, but you can see there's a shadow. So make sure you switch back over to the sketch. When you're toggling back and forth between the picture and the sketch, sometimes I find myself drawing on top of the photo, which then I have to Control Z a lot. So I kind of wanted to add a little more detail here, just so I can really see how high up I'm going to make these shadows. And same with over here. This dog doesn't have distinct markings, so it's not like I'm tracing over big spots, different patterns. So this one's a little more subtle. I need to make sure I'm finding the structure of his face. So see how I'm toggling back and forth? And I notice, oh, I want a little more of this shadow here so I know how far in to paint. It doesn't need to be exact. It's really just to get an idea for my painting. It does turn out better if I make sure I include those main structures of the face. But here it is. So I'm gonna darken it. It's kind of hard to see sometimes. I'll send it darker to the client a lot of times. I can duplicate this layer and it'll make it even darker. So I can really see what I'm missing, where I need to go from here. I think it's done. It looks good to me. I'm going to take away that layer and then I'm going to get ready to print it. And I don't want to print it at 100% usually. It just depends on how dark my brush has been. So the opacity is turned on pretty low. Usually I'm closer to like a 65 here, but it still works. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to get ready to print it. And you can see I added here, I'll erase them so I can show you again. I had it here, I kind of draw back and forth to get the very corner. And so now I have this little black spot in the corner here, and I have a little black spot in the corner here. I'll do it again for you, like this. And this is gonna help me know where to cut my paper. Because right now, this is printing on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and I need to trim it down to an 8 by 8. I could guess, but I got this so precise in my crop and centered exactly where I want it. This is a really good marker for me to know where to cut it. The other thing is when it pulls through the printer, it doesn't always load exactly straight. So by doing one at the bottom and at the top, I can line it up on my paper cutter to cut this line first so it's exactly straight. So now I'm going to show you how to cut and load the paper. To get my sketch from my computer onto my watercolor paper, I need to start by trimming my paper down to fit in the printer. So I use the 9x12 paper and I trim it down to a 8.5 by 11. This is the printer I use. It's really old. They've made a few other versions of this since it came out. But basically you want a laser printer, not an inkjet, because that ink will bleed with water. The laser printer is great, but you want to make sure it has a flap that opens in the front and in the back. And then I'm going to take my paper I trimmed down, I'm going to feed it through the front and line it up. I'm going to push it all the way back and hold it for a minute while this printer wakes up and gets ready to load it. So it pulled it back and now it's ready to print. So I have my sketch all ready to go. The opacity is turned down enough so that it's not going to print super dark. And I just command print. And it doesn't really matter with an 8x8 which orientation it is. So I'll just go ahead and print that. And then I wait for it to come out. And now it's ready to trim down and stick to my board to paint. Sometimes there's little spots that the laser printer will get on your paper and they're not actually printed, they're just kind of left over on the roll. So I'll take some masking tape and I kind of use it as an eraser to lift some of those little spots. Now I have one mark here and I actually lifted that mark, but you still kind of see it. And this is where I'm going to start trimming the paper so I can get it exactly centered where my sketch was. It's really light, it's hard to see, but the little mark I made in the corner is where I'm going to line up along this seam. And then I check the top mark as well at the top because sometimes the paper gets pulled through a little bit out of an angle. This way it just keeps it square. I can lay this right on top of those points to make sure is exactly where I want it to go. And I always like to cut pushing the blade instead of pulling so that way I can keep the paper flat and it doesn't move. So I always trim that side first and then I find that spot again that I marked and I'll trim that area. And now from here I can measure it off of the inches. So I just line it up to the 8. And then I line it up again because this is an 8x8. If I was doing a large wash on the background, I wouldn't trim it so close because I would want to tape down the side. Since this is going straight onto my board and I'm leaving the background white, I can trim it directly to the size I want. To tape it to my board, all I'm going to do is roll up little pieces of tape and apply it on the back in little rolls. It doesn't need a ton of tape to adhere it to the board since I'm not putting washes over the entire paper. So I just roll it up on each corner like this. I don't stick it directly to the table, so I just stick this right on my hardboard and it's ready to paint. If you liked this video and want to learn more, my full watercolor course is linked in the caption. It walks you through the entire portrait process with supply lists, templates, and step-by-step tutorials.